This plant uses this fruit, it's a syzygium by the way, a lily pilly, to store energy. We humans have developed batteries to do this. In this video, I wish to present some simple concepts on the storage and use of electric power. I then want to analyse the role the South Australian Tesla battery plays as grid storage for renewable energy. When the South Australian battery was installed, it was the biggest grid battery in the world, and since then its size has been increased. It is held up by supporters of renewable energy, including our politicians, as a fine example of where the rest of Australia's electricity grid should be. So here's a picture of a battery connected to an electrical motor. And the battery contains energy in the form of chemical energy, which when the electric motor runs, it draws down the power from the battery and it converts it into, in this case, mechanical power. In much the same way that if this was a petrol engine and this was a petrol tank, the engine would draw the petrol down in and use the petrol and convert it to power. The question for us is, what's the capacity of the battery? How do you measure the capacity of a battery? So the battery capacity equals the output times the discharge time. So if this motor was a 1 kilowatt motor, that's its power output, and if it ran for 1 hour, it would use 1 kilowatt hour of power. Pretty simple. So if the battery was a 2 kilowatt hour capacity battery, it means that the battery could run this motor for 2 hours. And the same principle applies for grid power. So a grid's much bigger than a motor. When we're talking grids, we're talking megawatts rather than kilowatts. So a megawatt is 1,000 times a kilowatt, and a small grid is 1,000 megawatts. A small state grid is 1,000 megawatts. The same principles apply. If you had a grid that was 1,000 megawatts, if you wanted to run it for 1 day, it will need 24,000 megawatt hours of power. It's not that complicated. And from here we're going to look at some of the power requirements in South Australia, because South Australia has no coal power stations. It relies entirely on gas and diesel and renewables. So we return once again to the graph provided by the OpenNEM for electricity production in South Australia. And I choose South Australia because it has a claimed 60 to 80% renewable power as its source of electricity, and it also has a very celebrated Tesla battery to be used as a grid storage battery. So as you can see, as we've discussed here, the wind's blowing and most of the, or if not in excess of power for South Australia is produced by wind. Over here, not so much. It's night and there's not much wind, and there's a large proportion of gas power production, some diesel and some imported power, which is mostly coal. This graph is of measurements taken every half hour. And the great thing about this is you can export the data. And when you export the data, it looks like this. So it shows that at 3 o'clock on the 25th of May, imported power was contributing 174 megawatts to South Australia's power generation. Gas was 51 and 233. 819 of battery discharge, 970 of wind, and then some rooftop and utility solar. So you can analyse this data, and what I've done here in this column is I've added up the non-renewable power generation, So this sums up all the coal, gas and coal and diesel and whatnot. So as the afternoon wore on, you can see that the amount of wind dropped, and in order to keep the lights on, they increased the amount of non-renewable power generation. So this low wind situation, it kept on, and it kept on and on and on for quite a little time, for about 4 days, until the 29th of May in the morning at 11 o'clock. You can see the wind power increase, and it stayed up. So when you add those non-renewable power production figures up for each half hour, over 4 days, 92 hours, you get a total of 99,422 megawatt hours of non-renewable power production, which is an average non-renewable power output of 1,081 megawatts. So the Tesla battery was much celebrated, and it was brought in as the answer to these gaps in the renewable power production, so that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, that the Tesla battery would act as a storage grid. So after much digging, I found out that the Tesla battery has a capacity of 250 megawatt hours. This means that the battery would be able to run South Australia's grid during that time when renewable power was low, for a total of 14 minutes. So there was 92 hours of low wind, and the Tesla battery was able to supply 14 minutes, or 0.25% of the power required to keep the grid going, keep the lights on in New South Wales, South Australia. So here it is in graphical form. This is the capacity of South Australia's Tesla battery, 250 megawatt. And this is the power required to keep South Australia running for 4 days of low wind in that May period. Do you see that the battery might have been slightly deficient in its ability to act as grid storage? So, using the wonders of the spreadsheet, once again, I've worked out that by dividing the amount of power that can be produced by the battery by the amount that's needed, you'd actually need 398 Tesla batteries to replace the non-renewable power for 4 days. Now, the cost of a Tesla battery, who knows, they'd never really disclosed it, but it was around $100 million. So the cost of Tesla batteries to fill this 4-day power gap, 4-day renewable power gap, is 398 times 100 million is $39 billion. I'm pretty sure this doesn't include the cost of transmission lines, management systems, substations, etc. All the stuff you need to integrate 398 batteries into the current grid system. There's also the strong possibility that the lifespan of grid-sized lithium batteries is much reduced to as little as 5 years. So I think there must be some serious questions about the suitability of lithium-ion batteries as grid storage